I never thought I would talk about this, but I don't know how else to survive what happened. My wife and I had been married for 15 years, a partnership I truly believed was built on love, trust, and mutual respect. We weren't perfect, of course. Nobody is. But I'd always thought of us as a team. We'd weathered the storms that life threw our way and emerged stronger, or so I thought. In hindsight, there were signs, tiny, blinking warnings I'd dismissed. They weren't glaring red flags, more like faint whispers of unease I'd rationalized away. We both worked full-time jobs, which kept us busy, but we made time for date nights, trips, and lazy weekends binge-watching TV. At least we used to. Over the past year, our relationship had changed in subtle ways. Fewer shared laughs, less communication, and an unshakable distance that lingered between us. I chalked it up to midlife stress or the natural ebb and flow of a long-term marriage. I never imagined it was anything more than that. Then came the night that shattered everything I thought I knew. I had been away on a business trip, nothing unusual for me. My job often took me out of town for a few days at a time, and my wife never seemed to mind. This particular trip was supposed to last 5 days, but the meetings wrapped up early, and I managed to book an earlier flight. I was ecstatic about surprising her. I stopped at the florist on my way home and bought her favorite flowers, a bouquet of lilies and roses. I even grabbed takeout from our favorite Thai place. By the time I pulled up to our apartment building, it was close to 9 p.m. I imagined her sitting in the living room, maybe catching up on one of her shows or scrolling through her phone. I couldn't wait to see her face when she opened the door and realized I was home early. But the moment I reached the door, something felt off. The deadbolt was locked. Now, this might not seem significant to anyone else, but we had an unspoken rule about that lock. We only used it when we were both home. At first, I thought maybe she had locked it out of habit and forgotten. I pulled out my keys and tried to unlock the door, but of course, the deadbolt wouldn't budge. I knocked lightly, not wanting to startle her. No response. I knocked again, harder this time, and called out her name. Still nothing. By now, I was getting a little annoyed. Maybe she had her headphones in or was in the shower and couldn't hear me. So I called her phone. To my surprise and growing unease, I heard her ringtone faintly through the door. She wasn't in the shower, and unless she'd gone deaf in the last hour, there was no way she couldn't hear me knocking or calling. I tried calling again and again. Each unanswered call added to the sinking feeling in my stomach. I started knocking louder, pounding on the door with enough force that I was sure our neighbors could hear. I even shouted her name, something I never would have done under normal circumstances. It was embarrassing, but I was too anxious to care. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. I stood there, flowers in hand, my annoyance slowly giving way to worry. What if something had happened to her? What if she was hurt or unconscious? The thought gnawed at me, and I considered calling the building manager to unlock the door. Just as I was about to take that step, I heard the soft click of the deadbolt sliding open. The door creaked open an inch, and there she was. Something about her appearance struck me as off. Her hair was a mess, her face pale. She wasn't wearing her usual comfy loungewear, but an oversized sweatshirt that didn't belong to me. Her eyes darted nervously, as if she were expecting something or someone. She quickly explained that she had fallen asleep and hadn't heard the knocking or her phone. The explanation didn't make sense to me. I'd been knocking and calling for nearly an hour. I'd heard her phone's ringtone through the door. There was no way she hadn't heard me. I stepped inside, still clutching the flowers, trying to make sense of the situation. That's when the first wave of unease hit me. The apartment smelled different. It wasn't anything obvious, just a faint mix of perfume and something else I couldn't quite place. The air felt heavier, as if the walls themselves were holding a secret. Glancing around, I scanned the room for anything out of place. Everything seemed normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. My wife lingered near the door, avoiding my gaze and fidgeting with the hem of her sweatshirt. When I asked her why the deadbolt had been locked, she shrugged it off, claiming she must have done it out of habit. Her response felt hollow, But I didn't press further. My mind was already racing, the gut feeling that something wasn't right growing stronger by the second. Little did I know, that moment marked the beginning of the end of the life I thought I knew. I wanted to believe her. After all, this was the woman I'd loved and trusted for 15 years. But something didn't sit right. As I moved further into the apartment, I caught a faint whiff of alcohol. Not the usual scent of wine we sometimes shared over dinner, but something stronger, mixed with an unfamiliar sweetness. Then I saw it. An empty box of chocolates on the counter and an open champagne bottle in the trash. Neither of us were big drinkers, and the chocolates weren't the kind I would have bought for her. They were the fancy, imported kind she always mentioned but never splurged on. When I questioned her about the champagne and chocolates, she tried to explain that she had treated herself while I was out of town. Her face flushed as she spoke, her hands fidgeting nervously, and the explanation felt rehearsed, like she had anticipated my question. The pit in my stomach deepened. As I placed the box back on the counter, my eyes wandered to the hallway that led to our bedroom. The door was ajar, and from where I stood, I could see the edge of our comforter hanging slightly off the bed. Normally, she was meticulous about keeping things tidy. Little details like that wouldn't have caught my attention on any other day, but tonight, every misplaced item felt like a clue. I started toward the hallway, but her voice stopped me abruptly. She demanded to know why I was acting suspiciously and accused me of making her feel as though she'd done something wrong. Turning back to her, I challenged her inconsistencies. Her explanation about the deadbolt being locked, ignoring my calls for an hour, and the champagne and chocolates in the trash. None of it made sense. Her lips parted as if she wanted to respond, but no words came out. Instead, she crossed her arms defensively, her eyes flickering toward the hallway. That was when a chilling realization hit me. I asked her if someone else was in the apartment, my voice sharp and low. Her reaction said it all. Her face went pale, and her eyes widened for the briefest of moments before she recovered, shaking her head and trying to brush off my suspicion as ridiculous. I didn't believe her. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Ignoring her protests, I stormed down the hallway. The bedroom was empty. The bathroom, too, revealed nothing. But when I turned toward the storage closet at the end of the hall, her panicked voice rang out, begging me not to open it and insisting there was nothing inside. Ignoring her completely, I yanked the door open. There he was, a man I had never seen before, crouched awkwardly between a stack of old boxes and a pile of winter coats. His face was flushed, his shirt partially unbuttoned. He looked up at me with a mixture of fear and shame, like a child caught stealing cookies. For a moment, I was speechless, my mind struggling to process what was in front of me. This wasn't some bad dream I could wake up from. This was real. The man scrambled to his feet, mumbling incoherently as he edged past me. My wife appeared behind me, her face streaked with tears, and she began pleading for me to hear her out. I demanded to know what was going on, my anger spilling over as I gestured toward the stranger who had just run out of my home. She stood there sobbing, unable to explain anything coherent. The silence she left hanging in the air said more than any words ever could. Finally, I demanded to know how long this had been going on. At first, she insisted it was a mistake, something that didn't mean anything, but I pressed her until she admitted the truth. It had been 6 months, a deliberate and ongoing betrayal. The weight of her admission hit me like a ton of bricks. This wasn't a one-time lapse in judgment. This was a calculated deception that she had maintained for months, right under my nose. My head spun, and I had to steady myself against the wall to keep from falling. When I asked if she had brought him into our bed, her silence spoke louder than any answer she could have given. Her guilt was written all over her face. A surge of emotions coursed through me: rage, heartbreak, disbelief. I wanted to scream, to cry, to demand explanations, but I couldn't find the words. The overwhelming weight of her betrayal rendered me numb. I turned and walked out of the apartment, leaving her standing there, sobbing in the hallway. As I stepped into the cool night air, the reality of what had just happened began to settle over me. The woman I had loved, trusted, and built a life with had betrayed me in the worst possible way. And the worst part? I had no idea what to do next. I drove aimlessly for hours after leaving the apartment. My phone buzzed repeatedly with texts and calls from her, but I couldn't bring myself to answer. I didn't want to hear her excuses or apologies, not yet. My mind was a chaotic mess, replaying every moment of our marriage, desperately searching for the signs I had missed. How could I have been so blind? Eventually, I found myself parked in an empty lot. The silence was suffocating, but it gave me the space I needed to think. I realized I couldn't let the situation drag on. I needed answers, even if they shattered me further. When I returned to the apartment, it was past midnight. The lights were still on, and she was sitting on the couch, her eyes red and swollen from crying. She looked up at me as I entered, and her expression was a mixture of guilt and relief. She acknowledged that I had come back and seemed both tentative and trembling, clearly unsure of what to say. I stood in the doorway, arms crossed, keeping my distance, and told her to start explaining. She nodded, her face streaked with tears, and began apologizing, her voice breaking as she said she never intended to hurt me and didn't know how things had spiraled out of control. Her vague statements only heightened my anger, and I demanded details: who he was, how it started, and why. She reached for a tissue and took her time wiping her face, clearly stalling as she struggled to form a coherent explanation. Finally, she admitted that his name was Michael and that they had met at a yoga class. Hearing this, my mind flashed back to the evenings she had started attending those classes, claiming they were a way to manage stress. I had been so supportive, encouraging her to take time for herself. Meanwhile, she had been meeting him. When I pressed her for the timeline, she reluctantly confirmed that it had been going on for 6 months. The admission made my fists clench, and I had to steady my breathing to contain my anger. I accused her of bringing him into our home and into our bed, unable to contain my disbelief that she could cross such a line. She shook her head and insisted that it hadn't been like that, claiming that he had never stayed overnight and that this was the first time he had been in the apartment. Her attempts to downplay the situation only fueled my bitterness. I sarcastically remarked on the timing, saying it was convenient that I had caught her on his supposed first visit. She pleaded further, saying she hadn't expected me to come home that night and insisting that it wasn't meant to happen this way. Her words only deepened my fury. I accused her of apologizing not for the betrayal, but for the fact that she had been caught. The harshness of my tone made her flinch, but she didn't respond. Instead, she sank deeper into guilt, her face a mask of regret and shame. I voiced my devastation, pointing out the depth of her betrayal. After 15 years of building a life together, this was how she had repaid me. Her tears started again, flowing freely as she admitted to knowing that she had ruined everything. She insisted it wasn't about me, claiming it wasn't because of anything I had done. Her statement enraged me even further. I demanded an explanation, asking her to justify her actions and to help me understand what could possibly excuse such a betrayal. She remained silent for a long time, staring at the floor as she twisted a tissue in her hands. Finally, she admitted that it had started with curiosity. Michael had shown her attention, and at first their conversations had been innocent. But things had escalated, and once it started, she hadn't known how to stop. Her words made my head spin. Curiosity and attention? That was all it had taken to unravel 15 years of marriage? I stared at her, struggling to contain the storm of emotions building inside me. I couldn't stop myself from questioning her judgment. I told her she could have avoided it altogether by respecting our vows and setting boundaries. Her confession only deepened the betrayal, offering no clarity or closure. I had given her everything: my love, my trust, my entire self. And yet she had chosen to risk it all for what? Curiosity? A fleeting thrill? She tried to explain that it wasn't about me and that she hadn't set out to hurt me. She claimed she had gotten caught up in the situation and hadn't been able to pull herself out. I shook my head, unable to comprehend how someone I thought I knew so well could become a stranger in this way. Her sobs grew louder as she broke down completely, but I felt no sympathy. The pain of her betrayal consumed me, and I couldn't see past my own anguish. Part of me wanted her to feel the same level of devastation she had inflicted on me. Then, through her tears, she said something that stopped me in my tracks. She claimed she had never wanted to leave me, that even now she wanted to fix things and save our marriage. Her audacity stunned me. She was asking how we could rebuild trust after something so irreparably damaging. Her desperation was evident, but it only made me more aware of the chasm her actions had created between us. I couldn't bring myself to make a decision in that moment. As I stood there, watching her crumble on the couch, I realized that even if I stayed, things would never be the same. She had shattered the life we had built together, and no amount of apologies or tears could change that. Still, I couldn't walk out the door again, not yet. I needed time to think, to process everything, and to figure out whether this was something I could move past or if it was the end of everything we had shared. The days following her confession felt like being trapped in a fog, an endless loop of anger, sadness, and disbelief. Every moment was consumed by the weight of her betrayal. Her words replayed over and over in my mind as I tried to make sense of how our life together had unraveled so completely. She had explained that it started with curiosity. That single word, so simple yet devastating, haunted me. It wasn't a calculated decision or an uncontrollable moment of passion. Instead, it was the slow erosion of boundaries I had thought were unshakable that made it even harder to bear. At first, anger consumed me entirely. I was furious at her, at him, and even at myself for not seeing the signs sooner. I second-guessed every memory, every interaction. I questioned whether she had ever been fully present in our marriage, or if there were other lies hidden beneath the surface. My mind became a battlefield, torn between the life I thought we had and the ugly truth that had been exposed. Sleep became a distant memory. Night after night, I found myself pacing the living room or staring at the ceiling, crushed by the weight of what had happened. The flowers I had bought for her, the ones meant to be part of a sweet surprise, wilted on the counter, a painful symbol of the night everything fell apart. As the anger began to subside, sadness crept in, settling like a cold drizzle over everything. I couldn't look at her without feeling the ache of what we had lost. The woman I loved, the partner I trusted, had made a choice that destroyed everything we'd built together. And yet, despite the pain, part of me still cared for her, clinging to the memories of happier times. The hardest part wasn't the anger or sadness. It was the doubt. Her betrayal had ripped a hole in my self-esteem that felt impossible to repair. I began to question whether I had been enough for her, or whether there was something inherently wrong with me. I obsessed over my appearance, my personality, and every perceived flaw, trying to uncover why she had sought someone else. Every imperfection felt magnified, a glaring reminder that I wasn't good enough. Initially, I tried to navigate it alone, convinced that I could handle the pain on my own, but the weight of it all was too much. On the advice of a friend, I began seeing a therapist. It wasn't easy. Opening up about something so raw felt like ripping off a bandage during every session, but it became my lifeline, keeping me from drowning under the emotions that threatened to consume me. Through therapy, I started to unravel the layers of pain and confusion. I began to understand that her betrayal wasn't a reflection of my worth, but a result of her own choices and insecurities. While that realization didn't lessen the pain, it helped me stop blaming myself for what had happened. There were days when I hated her with every fiber of my being. There were days when I missed her, unable to forget the years we had shared. And there were days when I felt completely numb, unable to process anything at all. The emotional roller coaster was exhausting, but gradually, I began to find moments of clarity. I started journaling, pouring my thoughts on a paper in an attempt to untangle the chaos in my mind. I leaned on friends and family, even though sharing the details of her betrayal felt humiliating. Their support reminded me that I didn't have to face this alone. One moment of clarity came late one night as I sat alone in the apartment, surrounded by the remnants of our shared life. I realized I couldn't keep living like this, trapped in the past, haunted by what she had done. I needed to make a decision to take back control of my life. Whether that meant trying to rebuild together or walking away for good, I wasn't sure yet. But one thing became clear. I deserved better than this. Each day brought new emotions. Some were overwhelming, others manageable. But I began to understand that healing wasn't about erasing the pain. It was about learning to carry it, to let it shape me without letting it define me. I wasn't there yet, not even close, but for the first time since that night, I felt a flicker of hope. Hope that I could survive this. Hope that, no matter what happened, I could find myself again. Making the decision to move forward was the hardest thing I've ever done. For days, I went back and forth, debating whether to try to save our marriage or to let it go. She begged me to give her a chance, to try couples therapy, to work through what had happened. Part of me wanted to believe her, to cling to the hope that we could fix what was broken. But every time I looked at her, I was reminded of her betrayal. I realized that no amount of therapy or apologies could undo what she had done. Trust, once shattered, isn't something you can just glue back together. It takes time, patience, and a willingness to rebuild from both sides. But I didn't have the energy to start that process, not with her. Filing for divorce was a gut-wrenching decision, but it was also liberating. It was a step toward reclaiming my life, toward prioritizing my own well-being for the first time in years. When I told her my decision, she broke down, begging me to reconsider. She promised to do whatever it took to make things right. But it was too late. Her actions had spoken louder than any promise ever could. The weeks that followed were a blur of paperwork, awkward interactions, and difficult conversations with friends and family. Breaking the news wasn't easy. Some people were supportive, offering a shoulder to lean on or words of encouragement. Others were judgmental, questioning whether I'd done enough to save the marriage. But ultimately, I knew I'd made the right choice for me. The process of moving on wasn't linear. There were days when I felt strong, confident in my decision, and hopeful about the future. And then there were days when the pain felt as fresh as the night I discovered the truth. I'd find myself dwelling on the memories we'd shared, the plans we'd made, and the life we'd built together. Letting go of all that wasn't easy, but I reminded myself that holding on would only prolong the pain. Therapy became my lifeline, helping me navigate the roller coaster of emotions that came with the end of a 15-year marriage. My therapist encouraged me to focus on myself, to rediscover who I was outside of the relationship. It wasn't easy, but slowly I started to rebuild. I picked up old hobbies I'd abandoned, reconnected with friends I hadn't seen in years, and even started working out, a way to channel my anger and frustration into something productive. One of the biggest challenges was learning to trust again, not just others, but myself. Her betrayal had shaken my confidence, making me question my judgment and my worth. But as time went on, I began to see that her actions weren't a reflection of me. They were a reflection of her choices, her flaws, and her inability to face her own unhappiness. Looking back now, I realized that the marriage wasn't as perfect as I'd thought. There were cracks beneath the surface that I had ignored, believing that love and loyalty were enough to hold us together. I've learned that relationships take constant effort, communication, and honesty. And when those things are missing, it's only a matter of time before the foundation crumbles. If I could offer one piece of advice to anyone going through something similar, it's this: trust your instincts. If something feels off, don't ignore it. Have the hard conversations, even if they're uncomfortable. And above all, prioritize your own well-being. It's not selfish to walk away from something that's hurting you. The divorce was finalized a few months ago, And while I'm still healing, I've found a sense of peace I didn't think was possible. I'm learning to be happy on my own, to embrace the freedom that comes with starting over. Sometimes, I wonder if I'll ever fully trust someone again, or if I'll carry this scar with me forever. But for now, I'm focusing on me, on rebuilding my life one step at a time. What about you? Have you ever had to rebuild after a betrayal? If you have any advice, I'd love to hear it. Let's help each other navigate this messy thing called life. Thank you for listening. Goodbye, everyone.